anything.
USSD.
USSD.
Not the US. SSD.
And disconnection. Well,
and the D in that
NCC
USSD doesn't stand for disconnection.
Has wielded the big stick. The CBN stated that payment agreements, whether as lump sums or installmentals, must be finalized by January 2nd, 2025, with full settlement due by July 2nd of this year. Telcos are now backed by NCC to suspend the unstructured supplementary service data USSD services over poor commitment from 9 banks. In fact, the CBN stated the 9 banks involved. This means that in a matter of weeks, some services which you enjoy on your telephone will be suspended. And the NCC has given its backing to that. And when the NCC backs something like that, then you, the subscriber, you have a problem. Professor of Legal, Social and Political Environment of Business and Head of Department of Strategy at the Lagos Business School, Professor Olawale Ajai, will join us to look at this particular matter. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning to you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Yes, sir. So how is it, sir, that the monies involved in this thing have reached such a high figure before anything was done about it?
Well, this has built up from, I think, 2019. Initially, the banks disputed any responsibility to pay. The idea being that, well, the telcos are the ones charging and they should just bill the customers. I think initially customers were very unhappy about end user billing, and probably around that time when the USSD came into bloomed, I think the central bank issued a circular, I think in 2017 or so, and then in order to sell it or to make it more acceptable, I think the issue of end user billing was dropped and the banks started to charge. Well, the banks started to charge, and the telcos then said, well, we're supposed to get part of that. And then there was that dispute, I think around 2020. I think at the initial start, I think it was about 40 billion or so that the telcos said they were being owed. I do remember distinctly that the former governor of Central Bank, or rather, let me say the Central Bank initially more or less told the banks to ignore the telcos. But in 2021, when this matter became heated, I think about that time the telcos were saying the debt was around 80 billion or so. The National Assembly got involved and apparently was able to get accommodation. And so a charge of 6 naira 98 kobo was agreed. Is this and which was not paid? Of course, banks disputed the amount the telcos said should be charged. Between the telcos and NCC, the telcos had to justify, the cost that they attributed to use of USSD services. The good thing, I think, is that NCC and CBN started singing, apparently on the same page from 2021, but certainly from last year, I think it's a good thing that the two regulators really now, sort of were working somewhat harmoniously to try and ensure that the issues are resolved.
Okay. Professor, let me just take you back a bit. Can you just explain to us how this USSD thing works so that everybody is on the same page?
Well, ordinarily, I think I can put it this way: you want to make a payment that ordinarily you would have to go onto your internet banking, or there are apps that the FSBs, the financial service providers provide for you to do your transactions.
So that's
you would need internet.
Sorry. The bank apps.
The banks.
Okay.
Yes, bank apps.
Okay.
Payment provider apps.
Okay.
Or you go right onto internet banking.
Okay.
Would normally be the way that you would pay for services or do transfers and so on and so forth. Now, USSD happens to be a protocol that allows you to pay without needing internet service. It's also somewhat quite nimble in terms of usage. Of course, it is still the telcos that provide the signals from your mobile phone. The instructions that you provide in your mobile phone, just that, and these instructions, of course, are encrypted to make sure that your sensitive details are not released. But the instructive part of it is that you do not need internet, you do not need to have data in order to use USSD services. And this, for those who will call the financially excluded, people who have no banking accounts, people who are in the rural areas, who probably don't even have internet services in those areas, with their feature phones, not the smartphones, can do transactions, can receive money from their relatives and so on. Even can buy inputs, whether farming inputs, etc. So I think that is the major feature of the USSD applications. If I believe both of you have smartphones, but for some reason, if you suddenly are unable to get internet services and you need to, subscribe or renew subscription for your mobile data, you probably have to ask somebody to please send data to your number. But if you have USSD, even if you didn't have internet services, generally you would be able to carry out your transactions. The other point, of course, is that internet services can be problematic in terms of connectivity. Some of these apps, banking apps and so on, can also have bugs and problems, etc. So the USSD is mainly, I would say, for those you will call in the mass market, those in the rural areas, those who do not have the ability to afford smartphones. So it's a major feature of financial inclusion, which the central bank has also touted, and which the banks and other financial players tell us that they are committed to. So this problem would affect those categories of people the more.
Prof, I just tried the USSD of my bank, and I didn't do anything. I just tapped it, 5 digits, star, this, hash, and I entered, and then I got a response, and then I dismissed. And I was charged 6 naira 98 kobo immediately.
for doing nothing, for tapping on the app.
Yeah, I just checked if my bank is USSD is still active. 6 naira 98 kobo, and if we look at that possibility of being charged like that by every Nigerian who uses this from time to time, that's quite a huge resource. What do you think could be responsible for this tiff between the banks and the telcos that's gotten this high? Because I'm sure that it's not a matter that just suddenly came up and then the NCC put its stamp on the telcos disconnecting things. What do you think could have made it worse to this point?
Well, let me just preface my answer with some intrigue. Let me say I'm intrigued that you are charged right away, because what we are made to understand is that if you're not on USSD for more than 10 seconds, you may possibly escape from being billed at all, and that's what is that is.
Just to be clear, it says description, telco fee, MTN, and I don't want to mention the bank, but that's 6 naira 98 kobo is what I've been charged.
Yeah, so that's the point I'm making, that ordinarily we're made to believe that if you don't spend more than 10 seconds, you probably may not even be charged at all. But the point of the fact is that, telecommunication services have to be powered. You have to have the masts, you have to have the staff. So these are certainly not free services. In fact, telecommunication services have become vital infrastructure, even though maybe run by private persons. But practically everything we do has to ride on this telco infrastructure. And ordinarily, somebody ought to pay for services that are rendered, whether they are banking services or telco services, because after all, there is a cost to rendering those services. So I think that is the primary rationale for for charging. The important thing will be to make sure, that's from the regulatory point of view, that the price attributed to the services are relative to the actual expenses that are incurred by the telcos and also by the banks. As I did mention, initially there was end user billing, which was somewhat resisted, and it was felt that probably the banks could more easily, charge and then remit, those charges to the telcos. Somehow the banks have been charging us, from get-go, but the telcos were not receiving anything. And so I guess the telcos now felt that, look, you are making this revenue on the basis of services we provide, which is not being paid for. We deserve to also have a share of that revenue. I guess it was more like free funds for the banks, and they were very happy to have it. And their regulator was not necessarily insisting that they should pay. So I would say that all of this TIF is really about ensuring that the telcos get satisfaction relative to the costs that they are rendering to the banks. And the fact that the NCC is behind them means that they have justified to the NCC, the costs that they attribute. And simply what has happened is that since 2021, when it was accepted that the telcos should be paid, the banks have not remitted. Well, the banks do dispute, those figures, but I think with the settlements that have been made, those figures are probably now quite certain. The issue is whether the banks would pay, on time. You probably can't pay lump sum, but you can pay over time. But apparently, as we have seen, Some banks have paid. I think we understand that like 4 banks have paid up their indebtedness, and some banks are still either have not paid or still owing substantial sums. So the agreement backed by the CBN and the NCC is, in fact, to write off, 60% of certain portion. Is to write off 40% of certain portion of that indebtedness. More or less like a full and final settlement, and all the other portions to pay them within time limits. And therefore, transactions that will be incurred going forward to pay 85% of the bills in the month in which those bills are submitted.
Prof, that suggests, therefore, that these payments were supposed to have been made over time, month by month.
Correct.
So how did the telcos wait 6 years? Because we understand that this dispute has been going on for 6 years for monies that were supposed to have been paid every month.
Yes. Well, as I did mention, at a point, the banks, were of the impression that they did not owe. That after all, the telcos charge their clients for services. And so the telcos should charge their clients. And of course, when, that, as I did mention, the notion of end billing was not very welcome. So that was one hurdle. And of course, the banks have been, charging off USSD services. And so the telcos now said, well, we ought to get a portion of that. The banks pushed back and said, well, charge your customers directly. And when this regulatory intervention came in, it was agreed that 6.98 naira was a fair price for the transaction, which would be charged by, for the services and transferred to the telcos. So I think that is really where the problem is. The problem is really more about the so-called legacy debts, which apparently have now been agreed, but because they were not being paid, they were just piling up to the at one point 250 billion. We understand now it reduced to about 140 billion. I would just say on my part that whatever charges are made, it's always the customer that pays.
Yes.
And you really also cannot say banks should not charge for services, telcos should not charge for service. The more important point is that those charges should be fair, and there should be transparency so that consumers are not being cheated or, are not the proverbial was in a ball that is being kicked around by big bullies. So I think that the other point, of course, is that if you want to encourage financial inclusion, as I did mention, the USSD is certainly integral to ensuring that, let's call them the bottom of the pyramid. People who probably don't even have a job or don't have a steady income can be included financially, and from that point, maybe their economies can blossom. We do need to ensure that this financial inclusion is pushed, and it may well be from a public interest point of view that the regulators need to find a way to subsidize some people. Some people may have to subsidize those who are less able to pay. This will be, regulatory, decisions that may have to be made in the public interest to ensure that, there's some redistribution of income and there are developmental impacts and effects which will be for the overall benefit of the nation. But I guess that will be a later thing to discuss.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Prof, we've almost run out of time completely, but just as a matter of interest, how much of this 698 charged per transaction should go to the telcos?
Well, that is supposed to go to the telcos.
Oh, all of it?
That is the charge that's supposed to go to the telcos, yes.
All of it?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Professor Olawale Ajai, Professor of Legal, Social and Political Environment of Business and Head, Department of Strategy at the Lagos Business School. Thank you very much for coming to enlighten us on this very important matter.
Thank you for having me.
Well, just before we take a break, we have this information to put out to you of a man who has gone missing. On the 6th of January this year, a man of whose name, of course, Moses Nwoye, who is right there on your screen, was visiting his child in Onekpanu, Lagos, and he went missing after leaving home around 5 p.m. same day. Efforts to contact him revealed he was disoriented and unable to describe his location. We understand his last known location tracked on the 15th of January was near 108 Western Avenue in Surulere, Lagos, around the National Stadium Bridge. The family has filed a missing persons report and appeals for your help. If you've seen him or have any information, please contact that number on your screen. Thank you so much. When we return, we'll take on the next conversation. Do stay with us.